Last night, the internet did not just react, it froze. Because one sentence dropped on a live stream changed the entire narrative people thought they understood. And now everyone is asking the same question: were we lied to from the very beginning? What if the night everyone called confusing, blurry, and misunderstood was actually clear the whole time, just carefully edited for public consumption? What if Funky was never guessing, never reaching, never exaggerating, but saying out loud what others were terrified to confirm? Because when Tasha K leaned in and said Tamar herself confirmed that the Mendeecees night was real, not misremembered, not exaggerated, not twisted, the air shifted. Suddenly, Yandy allegedly exploding was not drama, it was pressure cracking. The timeline that once felt emotional now feels strategic. The silence that once felt like trauma now feels selective. And the internet is no longer asking what happened that night, it is asking who knew the truth and let someone else take the fall. Every smile, every interview clip, every deleted comment now feels different. This is not gossip anymore, this is a story about control, a mission. And the moment a carefully built narrative starts collapsing under its own weight, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The moment this story cracked open, it stopped being about one night and started being about everything that happened around it. Because when names like Tamar, Funky, Mendeecees, Tasha K, and Yandy all end up in the same sentence, you are no longer dealing with coincidence, you are dealing with collision. For months, the public was fed a version of events wrapped in confusion, emotion, and selective memory. A story that leaned heavily on pain while staying strangely quiet about structure, people, and sequence. Tamar's interview painted a picture of chaos without faces, fear without witnesses, and injury without context. And the internet accepted it because vulnerability sells and nobody wants to question someone who appears broken. But behind the scenes, according to whispers that refused to die, there was another version breathing quietly, a version that did not rely on fog but on footsteps, locations, and body language. Funky was never the loudest voice in the room. And that is exactly why his account is now haunting people. Because it was delivered without theatrics. Without tears, without outrage, just discomfort and memory. When his live went viral, it did not explode because of what he accused, it exploded because of what he described. And those descriptions clashed violently with what the audience thought they knew. He spoke about movement, about who sat where, about energy shifts that do not happen in isolation, and suddenly Tamar's story felt incomplete rather than incorrect. The internet started rewinding everything, not just the night, but the interviews, the captions, the silences, the moments where names should have appeared but did not. And right there, floating unspoken but heavy, was Mendeecees. A presence Funky claims changed the entire temperature of the evening, yet a name that never crossed Tamar's lips publicly. That omission alone became louder than any allegation. Then came Tasha K, who has made a career out of lighting matches near gas leaks, casually dropping that Tamar herself had confirmed the night was real. Not imagined, not blurred beyond recognition, but real enough to validate what Funky had been saying all along. That one statement detonated weeks of carefully managed ambiguity. Because if Tamar knew the night was real, then the confusion narrative starts to wobble. If the interactions were real, then the silence around who was involved becomes intentional rather than protective. And when Yandy allegedly exploded after that confirmation surfaced, people stopped seeing her reaction as drama and started reading it as panic mixed with frustration. According to alleged insiders who conveniently appear whenever a story turns ugly, there were conversations happening long before Funky ever went live. Conversations about optics, relationships, and how damaging it would be if certain dynamics became public. These sources claim the goal was never to frame anyone as guilty, but to keep the story simple, emotional, and centered on injury rather than interaction. The problem with simplicity is that it collapses when someone adds details. Funky did that, and instead of being met with discussion, he was met with suspicion, dragged as irresponsible, careless, and cold, while the people who actually stayed silent were wrapped in sympathy. The public reaction has now flipped, with fans questioning why Funky was allowed to absorb all that backlash while those closest to Tamar never corrected the narrative. Social media has turned into a forensic lab, with users comparing timestamps, facial expressions, and even background noises from old videos, searching for proof that the night was never as empty as it was presented. Sarcasm has flooded the timeline because people feel played. And nothing engages an audience faster than realizing their empathy may have been guided in a specific direction. Rumors are spiraling about after-hours damage control, private apologies, and alleged attempts to keep certain names out of headlines. All unverified, but feeding into a growing sense that this story was curated. Nobody is saying Tamar lied about her pain, but pain does not erase responsibility for clarity, especially when someone else's reputation is bleeding in the process. And as the internet digs deeper, the question is no longer what happened that night, but why the structure of that night was hidden, why Funky's discomfort was dismissed, and why the truth needed an explosion to finally surface once that door cracked open. Everything that had been brushed aside as speculation started lining up in ways that made people uncomfortable. Because patterns are harder to dismiss than rumors. And the pattern here was clear to anyone willing to look without bias. The narrative had been emotionally loud but structurally quiet, and that imbalance is usually where truth hides. As viewers went back to Tamar's interview with fresh eyes, they noticed how carefully it was framed. How every sentence centered on feeling rather than movement. How fear was emphasized while geography was erased. She remembered waking up, remembered pain, remembered confusion, but the hours before that moment were treated like dead air, as if nothing of importance could have possibly happened there. Meanwhile, Funky's recollection filled those hours with uncomfortable specificity, not because he wanted attention, but because memory tends to cling harder to moments you regret attending. He remembered the phone call, the casual invite, the lack of any celebration energy, which directly contradicted the birthday narrative that later surfaced. That detail alone shifted the tone because a planned celebration implies structure, intent, and witnesses, while a spontaneous meet implies something far more fluid. Anonymous voices began circulating claims that the birthday angle was added later to soften perception, to make the night feel communal and innocent rather than intimate and directional. These same alleged insiders suggested that Tamar was not drifting through the evening at all, but navigating it, choosing who sat where, who arrived when, and who stayed close. That portrayal clashed violently with the image of helpless confusion, and the internet picked up on it immediately. People started asking why Funky's story sounded like someone trying to exit a situation, while Tamar sounded like someone trying to survive one. Those are not the same emotional trajectories, and they rarely overlap by accident. The more clips resurfaced, the more people noticed how Funky's tone never sharpened into accusation, even when recounting moments that clearly unsettled him. There was no rage, no grandstanding, just fatigue, the kind that comes from carrying a story you never wanted to tell. By contrast, Tamar's delivery remained polished, calm, almost rehearsed, which is not proof of deception but does raise questions about preparation. If she truly did not remember, how was she so consistent in what she omitted? Consistency in absence is still consistency. And then there was the matter of Mendeecees, whose presence in Funky's account was not framed as scandal but as gravity, the point at which the night stopped feeling casual. According to Funky, the energy changed the moment he appeared. Conversations shifted, body language tightened, and suddenly Funky felt like an extra in a scene he had not auditioned for. That feeling of displacement explains his decision to leave better than any excuse could. Yet Tamar's public narrative made no room for that presence, as if acknowledging it would unravel something she worked hard to contain. Public reaction intensified when viewers realized that Funky had been the one absorbing months of criticism while Tamar never explicitly cleared his name. Silence can be neutral, but in moments like this, neutrality still has consequences. Commentators began framing that silence as protection not necessarily of guilt but of relationships, reputations, and future headlines. Speculation ballooned about what was at stake if the full context emerged, with exaggerated claims of brand deals, reality television contracts, and personal alliances allegedly hanging in the balance. None of it confirmed, all of it plausible enough to keep people watching. The sarcasm online turned sharper, with users joking that memory loss seems to activate selectively whenever certain names enter the room. Others pointed out that trauma does not erase spatial awareness, and that forgetting everything except the part that centers you is narratively convenient. Funky's discomfort, once dismissed as indifference, started reading as intuition, the kind that tells you to leave before a situation turns into something you will regret being associated with. As more imagined leaks circulated, claiming private messages existed where Funky begged Tamar to clarify publicly, but he was not involved. The pressure mounted. The alleged deletion of those clarifications became a turning point for public opinion, because removing context is an active choice. If the truth would have helped someone else, why erase it? That question echoed louder than any accusation ever could. Viewers started to see Tamar's story less as a lie and more as a carefully protected fragment, a version designed to minimize collateral damage by narrowing focus. Funky's version, by contrast, expanded the frame, dragging in people, movement and motive, not to assign blame but to explain why he walked away. That contrast is what made this story stick, because one account shrinks the world while the other enlarges it. And as the enlargement continued, the audience began to feel that the real scandal was not what happened after Funky left, but what was already happening before he did. The dynamics in motion, the intimacy implied, and the decisions being made quietly. By the time the internet finished stitching together theories, timelines and reactions, the question had evolved again. No longer about injury or confusion, but about intent, protection, and the cost of keeping certain truths off camera. By the time the dust started settling, it became clear that the real fallout was never going to be about proving who did what in the early hours of that morning, but about who controlled the story afterward and who paid the price for that control. What began as sympathy slowly mutated into skepticism as viewers realized how unevenly the consequences were distributed. Tamar received compassion, space, and understanding, while Funky was left to suffocate under assumptions, jokes, and accusations that were never fully corrected. That imbalance is what finally pushed the internet from curiosity into outrage, because audiences are willing to forgive confusion, but they resent manipulation. Alleged legal whispers started circulating, not in the sense of courtroom drama, but in the form of brand panic, contract concerns, and internal conversations about liability and image. People began speculating that this was never about criminal exposure, but about reputational containment, about making sure the narrative stayed emotional enough to discourage questions and vague enough to avoid scrutiny. Exaggerated rumors claimed crisis teams were activated, phones were ringing all night, and advisors were urging silence because saying less was safer than saying everything. Whether true or not, those rumors gained traction because they fit the behavior people were watching in real time. Yandy's alleged explosion suddenly looked less like shock and more like frustration at a storyline spinning beyond control. If Tamar really did confirm that the night was real, then the moral high ground shifted, and with it came an unspoken responsibility to clean up the damage left behind. But that cleanup never happened publicly, and in the absence of clarification, the internet filled the gaps with theories that grew more elaborate by the hour. Some claimed this could trigger internal investigations within reality television circles. Others joked about documentaries being pitched, while a louder group demanded accountability not in courts, but in honesty. Funky's decision to finally speak in detail reframed him not as a careless bystander, but as someone who exited a situation precisely because he sensed it was moving towards something complicated. His account did not accuse, but it implicated silence itself as the villain. The more people listened, the more they noticed how his story never changed, never escalated, never chased sympathy, it just stayed heavy and tired. That consistency made Tamar's omissions stand out even more. Her calm delivery, once seen as strength, began to feel like distance. Not coldness, but calculation. A way of telling just enough to be believed while withholding enough to stay protected. Public backlash. In the end, the scandal is less about betrayal and more about narrative power, about who gets to be seen as fragile and who gets stuck as expendable. And until someone finally connects all the dots without flinching, this story will continue to live in that uncomfortable space between what was said, what was seen, and what everyone knows is still being avoided. If you think this story still has layers we have not been allowed to see, drop your thoughts in the comments and tell us what you believe is being left out. Like, subscribe, and stay locked in because the truth does not disappear. It just waits for the next crack to come through.